Hi, Apush. So watch some puppy videos and get a sugar rush because we're going to talk the Great Depression. Now, ultimately, the Great Depression is just one of many economic panics, right? In some respects, structurally, it's very similar to the Panic of 1819, the Panic of 1837, um, 1873, 1893, 1907. I mean, we've talked about a series of economic panics that all involve some failure on the part of the banking system. But obviously, fortunately, the Great Depression isn't known as the Panic of 1819. It's known as, well, the Great Depression. So, to kind of give you a sense of why that's the case, why the Great Depression is different, let me start by telling you guys a story. My grandparents had two houses. Oh, Mr. Dry, you're bragging on behalf of your grandparents. Well, no, I don't mean that they had like a lake house or a beach house. What happened is they had a house, and apparently it caught fire, and the fire kind of gutted the place. And instead of, tearing it down or moving away or something, they decided to build another house right beside the place that had been gutted by fire. Now, we knew that they used it for storage. We didn't know just how much they used it until my grandmother passed away about 7 years ago. And when that happened, my mother and we went to that second house to see what was there. And it basically looked like a scene from the show Hoarders. Maybe not exactly this bad, but pretty close. And I'll say this for my grandparents: it wasn't like things were just strewn out everywhere. There was kind of a method to the madness. It was organized, but they had apparently saved anything and everything that could be saved. Like the little buckets of ice cream that you get at the grocery store. We would find bucket lids without buckets, bucket handles without buckets. We would find random spare parts to things that didn't clearly connect or belong to anything else. Torn out pages from books that didn't really have the original book. I mean, just everything you could imagine. And maybe out of despair, after an hour or so of organizing this, I just had enough. And I was like, what gives? Why in the world is, are we spending our time doing this? And why in the world couldn't they throw anything away? And I have to say, professionally, this was kind of a low point for me because it didn't dawn on me until my mom reminded me of the following: Wesley, your grandparents grew up during the Depression. And I remember that my grandfather grew up was actually born in 1929, the year of the Great Depression. And he was parented, he was raised in reaction to everything that had happened or everything that would happen over the next few years. And I think that the Great Depression, if you've ever had the privilege of meeting somebody who has grown up during the Great Depression, and unfortunately there aren't very many of them left, um, one of the things you kind of notice is that you see some things that kind of unite that generation together. The inability to throw things away, the worry that maybe you don't know where your next meal is coming from. That's what the Great Depression does to people. And as a historian, I have to kind of take a step back and remind you guys that not everything we talk about in this class would have been existentially important to people alive at the time. For instance, I would be lying to you if I told you that people in the late 1800s were convinced that the Sherman Antitrust Act was the most important event, the most important piece of legislation in their lifetime. That's just not going to happen. That doesn't mean that the Sherman Antitrust Act isn't important. It just means that not everybody was directly affected by it, or not everybody saw that it was important. The Great Depression is not one of those events. The Great Depression affects everybody. And not only does it affect everybody, it changes the way people think at a psychological level. But the Great Depression doesn't just change the way that people behave, it also changes the way countries behave. And there are two countries that we're going to focus on in this story. Uh, Both countries are disproportionately hit very hard by the Great Depression. Almost every country around the world is hurt by it, but there are two countries in particular that are hurt most of all by it. Both countries turn to two charismatic leaders to basically figure a way out of the Great Depression. And both leaders are given unprecedented power in order to do just that. If you haven't guessed already, the leaders I'm referring to are Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the United States and in Germany, Adolf Hitler. Now, the fact that Germany gets Hitler and the United States gets FDR, um, you could sort of argue that that is the byproduct of the history of both countries. The United States has a very different history, especially recent history, compared to Germany, which is still devastated by the First World War. But if you actually look at what both Germans and Americans are responding to after the Great Depression, one of the things you'll see is that some of the people who basically put Hitler into power in Germany, you're going to see similar individuals in the United States. Maybe not Nazis exactly, but at the very least, people who are willing to do whatever it takes and to blame whoever it takes in order to basically fix the problem. So as we go forward, ask yourself, why does America get FDR and why does Germany get Adolf Hitler? But before we actually get to that point, let's talk about where the Great Depression comes from. Basically, the version that you probably get in elementary school or middle school, maybe even a few other history classes in high school, is something probably like this: that the Great Depression is caused by a stock market crash. And yes, the Great Depression does get started because of a massive stock market crash in October of 1929. But that doesn't mean that the economy is fated for this prolonged decade of economic contraction. The stock market is an important part of the economy, but it is just a part of the economy. The fact that this crash leads to the entire economy going into shock for a few years, that's going to need a little bit more explanation. The second myth of the Great Depression is that while all this was happening, President Herbert Hoover, aka Satan, did nothing. And maybe it's unfair to characterize him as Satan, but by the way, a lot of people who were alive at the time basically called Hoover that because in their mind, President Herbert Hoover was responsible for the Great Depression. He's president of the United States, and it's his job to, correct the economy, and he didn't. One of the things we're going to find out is that Herbert Hoover actually did more than any other president in American history up to this point to actually fix the problem created by the collapse of the stock market in 1929. And it just wasn't enough. And maybe that just says more about the scale of the Great Depression than it does about Herbert Hoover's abilities as a president. Three, that FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, is elected in 1932 and implements this thing called the New Deal that fixes everything. And just like all sort of simple stories, that is not just really simple, it's also very incorrect. One of the things you're going to see in the follow up lecture is that to a certain extent, the New Deal and the Second New Deal are both failures if their goal, if their objective is to fix the Great Depression. They don't do that. But again, maybe that says more about the Great Depression than it does about FDR or the New Deal. Now, let's talk a little bit about Herbert Hoover, because Herbert Hoover is, is in the pantheon of unwanted or unloved presidents. He's up there with Andrew Johnson and James Buchanan. And to be honest, that's always been, at least in my mind, a little unfair. Because if you're trying to figure out who would be best situated to lead the country through an economic crisis, it's hard to imagine anybody better than Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover was given the nickname the Wonder Boy. And this is because apparently during the Woodrow Wilson administration, Herbert Hoover was charged with basically a relief campaign for the small besieged country of Belgium. You might remember that basically Belgium becomes kind of a doormat for the German army to walk over during 1914, and the German army basically occupies the country for, or at least most of the country, for about 4 years. And so food production starts to decline, and the people of Belgium look like they might starve. And apparently Herbert Hoover manages to organize a campaign to feed the people of Belgium. And maybe you don't necessarily have, let's say, a strong connection or a strong affection to the country of Belgium. Those of you who are in Mr. Honeycutt's class and have the Low Countries, I know that's a different story. But just to give you an idea, apparently Herbert Hoover was credited with saving millions of lives. He was called the greatest humanitarian in history because of his success there. Herbert Hoover was a Republican, but was seen as so competent that he serves in a Democratic administration. And when Warren G. Harding becomes president, Herbert Hoover becomes his, or one of his commerce secretaries towards the very end. He, along with a few other individuals, are responsible for the very strong economy that the United States had during the 1920s. So Hoover, by the way, was no intellectual slouch either. He was an engineer. And by the way, this is during a time period where, I mean, even still today, you don't necessarily have to know anything to be president. You have to be good at dealing with people and connecting with people. But Hoover was actually an engineer. And an engineer from a fairly humble background. He was an orphan who manages, I think, to go to pay his way through Stanford. I can't remember the school, but anyway, he goes to Stanford, becomes an engineer, starts an engineering firm in China, learns Mandarin, and apparently, I think up until his final days, he and his wife regularly spoke with one another in Mandarin. So this was a very, very bright guy. Somebody who knew how to run organizations. And again, for the most part, the American people recognized that. In the election of 1928, Herbert Hoover wins over his Democratic challenger, Al Smith, 444 electoral votes to 87. It's also important to note that the rest of the world is already in a depression, if not an outright recession at this point. If you look, for example, at unemployment in the UK. And the UK, and by the way, the United Kingdom, aka Great Britain, the UK was actually, compared to some of the other countries in Europe, doing okay, relatively speaking. And still, if you look at the unemployment rate, in 1919, you have basically a 2% unemployment rate. By 1921, that jumps up to over 10%. Just to give you an idea, during our Great Recession a few years back, unemployment peaked at around 10 to 12% for a very short period of time. So at the very least, it looks like the rest of the world is going through something similar to our Great Recession a few years ago. So the only country that really hasn't been negatively impacted by the First World War, it seems, is the United States. Remember that we have a small recession in 1920 and 1921, and the lesson that we learned during that recession is that if you batten down the hatches, if you cut spending, if you cut taxes, and basically just ride out the storm, you'll be okay. And so that's the lesson that basically we have immediately before the Great Depression. The fragility of the global economy was highlighted by something called the Dawes Plan. So if you remember back to the Treaty of Versailles, over the objections of Woodrow Wilson, Germany had to pay France, and to a lesser extent Great Britain, reparations for starting the war. And it was a sizable amount of money. In today's terms, it would be equivalent to $500 billion, with a T, by the way. The problem is that Germany didn't have the money to pay up because, spoiler, the German economy is wrecked by the First World War. So what happens is that Germany realizes that there's no way they can get out of debt. In fact, one of the things the French do is they actually send French troops into the Rhineland to basically put pressure on the Germans to pay up. Well, what the Germans realize is that they have to pay off the debt one way or the other. But it doesn't say that they can't just print more money, which is what they do. They basically debase their own currency to pay off these reparations. Well, then the problem for the French and the British is they planned on using these reparations to pay off the United States and basically U.S. investors that had basically lent France and Britain money during the First World War. And remember, one of the reasons why the United States joins the war is because of this enormous debt that France and Britain owe the United States and U.S. investors. So the problem is that if Germany doesn't pay off Britain and France appropriately, and if Britain and France don't pay off basically the debt they owe to the United States, well, then suddenly all this money that people are expecting just vanishes. Well, that can't happen because if that happens, that's going to lead to a massive depression. So here's what happens. The United States government sort of organizes a buyout with U.S. investors to lend Germany money so that Germany can turn around and pay off Britain and France. And so then Britain and France can turn around and pay off, U.S., Germany, Britain and France, U.S. Does anybody see the problem here, by the way? It doesn't make sense. We're almost lending money to somebody so that that person can turn around and pay us back. It doesn't make sense. And I'm not going to explain kind of the, let's say, the more in-depth economic rationale for this. Just know that the alternative here is that if this doesn't happen, if the Dawes Plan is not enacted, then the alternative is a depression, or at the very least, a recession. So, and it wouldn't just be something that would impact the United States. That would impact Britain and France, who are not doing very well at this point. It would also impact Germany. And so at this point, the United States government is one of the only countries on earth that has the ability to create this kind of plan and have it work. But just kind of look at what happens here. So this is the relative value of one Reichsmark, basically the German unit of currency in 1918. This is the basically the equivalent in 1923. Basically, 1 Reichsmark in 1918 was equivalent to, what is that? 000. That's 1 trillion Reichsmarks in 1923. That just shows you how insane the hyperinflation was. So let's jump ahead to where the dominoes start falling. And basically, the Great Depression begins on October 29th, 1929, a date called Black Tuesday. It's called Black Tuesday because approximately 16,410,000 shares of stock were sold on that day, where investors just want to liquidate what they have and turn their stocks and investments into easy cash. Now, again, in let's say the elementary or middle school version of the Great Depression, you probably hear that the Great Depression is something that begins on the stock market or is caused by the stock market. And, that's only part of the story because if you look at it in 1929, so you do have this massive sell off, but things actually look like they're improving in early 1930. Things go up and up, but then there's this steep sell off that happens after the market rallies in 1930. So what this says is that the Great Depression isn't something that happens in a day. It's also not something that happens exclusively in the stock market. Rather, the stock market can sometimes be almost a bellwether or a proverbial canary in the coal mine of that can kind of let you know when there are other problems going on. So the problem of the Great Depression is the fact that there's this speculative stock market bubble. And we talked about speculative bubbles at other points in this class beforehand. We talked about the fact that in the Panic of 1837, there was this speculative bubble around the sale of land. And one of the things that you kind of see is that during the Great Depression, you can clearly see the emergence of a bubble where it looks like the stock market is just almost artificially increasing in terms of the value of the shares. So how can we explain this? Well, the big reason is that, remember, during the 1920s, investing in the stock market was something that was normalized. If you invested $4,000 to $5,000 in General Motors in 1921, then by 1929 you would be a millionaire. A millionaire in not in the terms of today, but in the terms of the 1920s. And it didn't really seem like there was a whole lot of risk. Because remember, it's actually something that is a disclaimer for almost every stock brokerage firm in the country, where they have to tell you by law that investments come with a certain amount of risk. They didn't have those disclaimers then, but still, most people were kind of aware that sometimes the stock market has its good days, sometimes it has its bad days. Well, if you look at what's going on during the 1920s, you don't see a whole lot of risk up until 1929. From your perspective, if you haven't invested in the stock market and your friends have, what you're figuring out is that your friends are vacationing in places you can't afford. They're buying things that you couldn't dream of purchasing. In some respects, you're getting left behind. And the thing with a speculative bubble is that it's something where enthusiasm outpaces demand. Remember that anytime you're investing money in the stock market, you're investing it in businesses for the most part. And one of the most popular businesses to invest money in were the big car companies. Again, remember, American car companies led the world in terms of efficiency and productivity. The problem, for example, if you are investing money in General Motors or Ford, is the fact that there are only so many people who can afford or want to buy a car. So, just to kind of analogize it to computers or tablets today, nowadays, hypothetically, there's only so many tablets or so many computers a person can need. And so if you have one that works, well, you're not in the marketplace for one. The problem with the economy of the 1920s is that nobody is really anticipating the fact that demand for cars or goods is going to subside. And what's happening is that there's actually this problem called overproduction, where American businesses are getting too efficient at producing goods at lower cost. If you take the automotive industry, by the late 1920s, pretty much anybody who could have afforded to get a car has already gotten a car. And this is also kind of before the days of planned obsolescence. And so there's not this need to kind of, buy next year's model, at least not at this point. So what's happening is that businesses are kind of assuming that this industrial growth centered around the automotive industries is going to continue. And that's just not sustainable. So listen to this summary. The Great Depression was caused in part because American businesses were just too darn efficient. And that's right. And that can actually be a problem. American businesses were so good at producing huge quantities of modern, high-tech, quality goods at reasonable prices. So reasonable that, well, in the era before planned obsolescence, there was no need to buy next year's model. And so what happens is that there's this long-term problem for businesses, this problem of overproduction. So when coupled with the stock market panic in 1929, businesses decide to cut cost. They assume that now they're not going to be able to continue making money at the rate they were during the Roaring '20s. So what happens is that businesses cut their costs. And unfortunately, then and now, the most expensive single thing that businesses have to budget for are people, are employees. And so all across the country, you have massive layoffs. Now, in the history of depressions, this is not uncommon. We heard about this in the Panic of 1893, the Panic of 1873, that salaried industrial workers, that wage earners, are usually the first to go during these massive depressions. The problem is that in the 1870s and the 1890s, industrial workers, or let's just say salaried employees, were certainly a huge chunk of the workforce, but they weren't a majority. But by the 1920s, most Americans are living in cities. Most Americans are, in fact, salaried employees rather than farmers. And so what happens is that more people are out of work than ever before. Now, what happens is that, at this point, we kind of talked about the fact that American businesses are too efficient, that domestic markets in the United States have kind of tapped out. Well, that's not necessarily the case for foreign countries. So ideally, wouldn't it be a good idea if companies like Ford or General Motors or whatever could market their goods, sell their goods overseas? Well, what happens is that Congress decides to pass a protective tariff as a way to kind of protect businesses from foreign competition. This is the mother of all tariffs, the Smoot-Hawley tariff. I feel like the name Smoot-Hawley, it sounds like this great villain name. And to be honest, its role in American history is positively villainous because the Smoot-Hawley tariff increases tariffs by 60%. To be honest, if you're trying to figure out what you don't want to do during a depression is that don't pass the Smoot-Hawley tariff because at a time where you need trade, especially international trade, most of all, what Congress does is it passes the one thing that's guaranteed to murder international trade in its sleep. Trade declines by 50% because what happens is that once the United States passes the Smoot-Hawley tariff, other countries respond of tariffs of their own. So what happens is that the global economy kind of shuts down. It's not just a U.S. problem or a U.S. Response. It's a response that we see all across the world. So when you're laid off and you're out of a job, the thing that you're worried about is where's your next meal coming from? You know, what are you going to do to survive until next week? So what happens is that when Americans are laid off, they'll go and try to withdraw their savings from banks. So that's okay if you withdraw your savings or your friend withdraws their savings. But when everybody does it, you have scenes that look kind of like this. This is an image of one of the many bank runs that occurred across the country during the Great Depression. During these bank runs, Americans found out that the money they had invested in their savings accounts wasn't money that they could necessarily withdraw. And the reason being is that the banks didn't have that money on hand because Americans don't necessarily know how banking works. What happens is that when individuals invest money in banks, banks turn around and loan that money out to individuals so they can, buy a house or build a house or open a business. So there's no requirement, at least at this time period, for banks to have a large amount of money on hand. Now, the thing is that as long as the economy is doing pretty well, this system works. But if suddenly everybody tries to go and withdraw their savings from banks, banks won't have that money on hand and they'll have to go bankrupt. Nearly 9,000 banks across the country closed during the Great Depression. But that doesn't even begin to quantify the human cost involved.
I had been saving for maybe 5-6 years a piggy bank, money in a piggy bank. Nickels, pennies, dimes the most. It turns out that I was the only one in the family that had any money. Because one day I came home and I grabbed hold of my piggy bank just to give it a shake, and there was nothing in it. My mother was looking at me and she said, "Your father borrowed the money. He has to go out to look for work and he needed money to go downtown." And he came home and I didn't say anything, but my face was swollen with tears. My eyes were blinking with tears. And my father took me in his arms and he said, "I'm sorry. I had to have the money. But it's a loan. I'll pay it back to you." He never did. He never did.
My family had exhausted all its credits with the local merchants. And on one occasion, my father came home and asked what was for dinner that night, and my mother said, "There's nothing." How could that be? How could there be nothing? It was one of the few times in my life that I was fearful for myself.
Fearful of losing what little they had left, people rushed to the banks to withdraw their savings. But the banks too were short of cash. 1 year after the crash, 800 of them had failed. 9 million savings accounts were wiped out.
There was a janitor called George Kelly's who had $1,000 in the Bank of the United States. It had taken Galleys 40 years to save $1,000. After spending 2 nights and 2 days in the pouring rain outside this shuttered, locked bank, literally beating on the walls with his hands in frustration, he realized he was never going to see 10 cents of his money. And he went back to the basement where he lived, and he hanged himself in despair. That's what bank failures did. They crushed tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of ordinary people like George Galleys.
Just think about that. You could work for 40 years, and whether or not you would see a single cent of 40 years worth of work depended upon your place in line at the bank and how quickly you got to the bank once the bank panic started. And this is kind of where you guys need to realize that when we're talking about economic panics, we mean they're literal panics where people just go into survival mode. And it's a survival mode that's so powerful that if you remember the first account that I showed you, it involved a dad taking away his daughter's piggy bank money. And just note how emotional she still was, 50, 60 years after the fact. And that's one of the things that the Great Depression does. I mean, yeah, it wipes out people's savings, but people find out that people they thought they could trust, they couldn't trust. Whether you're talking about parents or spouses, friends, neighbors, the government, communities, it seems like everybody's dropping the ball. And so when we're talking about the Great Depression being the Great Depression, it does involve some literal depression because it also leads to warped and destroyed relationships. Americans are now out of work. They have no savings. And what's worse, if you look over the next few months and years to the Midwest, you see a dark cloud on the horizon. Because what's happened over the course of the 1920s is that farmers have had to resort to overproduction as a way to basically maintain profit margins by basically producing so many crops that they can lower prices and maintain profit margins. Well, the thing is that if you over farm, that depletes the nutrients in the soil. And in fact, the soil itself turns basically to dust. And the winds of the Midwest pick that dust up and layer it across a vast swath of the center of the country. I mean, just think about that. It almost sounds like, I don't know, Ragnarok. It sounds very Old Testament at the very least. I mentioned that it was a myth that the federal government does nothing in response to all this, though. Herbert Hoover and the U.S. government actually do more than any other president or any other government in U.S. history up until this point. And it's important to remember that Herbert Hoover is an engineer by trade. And as an engineer, he's a problem solver. He's not just going to shrug it off and ignore the Great Depression a la Grover Cleveland and say that the federal government has no responsibility, no role constitutionally in fixing the crisis. He's also not going to do something radical like Andrew Jackson and issue a 20th century Specie Circular Act that destroys the economy. No, Hoover actually does quite a bit. He creates what is called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, in which this is basically an organization that's supposed to loan money out to businesses. And the thinking is that if businesses have that money on hand, well, you don't need to lay people off. You don't need to cut costs if the federal government has covered your costs. By the way, this is where I tell you that all modern day economics basically comes as a reaction to the Great Depression. For those of you who have heard of trickle-down or supply-side economics, this kind of comes from the Great Depression. And the Reconstruction Finance Corporation is an example of supply-side economics. And the thinking is this. If you're Herbert Hoover, if you look at the economy as a whole, you might think that the most important part of the economy is business. And if you look at big corporations like Ford or General Motors, if those corporations start to cut costs and start to basically cut down on production, that's going to lead to economic problems across the country. So in Hoover's mind, what's necessary is you got to keep these corporations afloat because they're the drivers of economic growth. And I think it was estimated around this time period that the automotive industry, the automotive sector of the economy, comprised something like 20% of American gross domestic product. So the idea is that you gotta help these corporations first because they're engines of growth. Now, of course, there are political problems with that approach because, one, corporations are already pretty wealthy, but if you kind of take a different look at it, there are actually other problems here. And the problem is this. Where does that growth come from? So if corporations are responsible for creating economic growth, is it because of what they produce? Is a car, for example, inherently valuable? Well, if you are a Keynesian, a term that's used to describe like a follower of the economic philosophy of John Maynard Keynes. By the way, it's not Keynes, it's Keynes for some reason. But if you're a Keynesian, what you would say is that a car is not valuable until you actually buy it. That's what gives a car value. The fact that people are want to willingly buy a car, but it's not valuable before that point. The problem is that if people are out of work, and they are during the Great Depression, they're not going to buy cars. They're not really going to buy anything because they can't. They have no ability to do that because they don't have a paycheck. Well, the argument is that if you give money to businesses, well, they're going to continue to employ people, and that economic growth will trickle down to consumers, to ordinary people. The problem with that argument, though, is that, of course, that is assuming that businesses continue as normal. And the problem is that after a depression, sometimes economic behavior changes. So if you're Ford or General Motors, for example, after an event like Black Tuesday, maybe you're just going to sit on that money given to you by the Reconstruction Finance Corporation rather than use that money to hire people. The thing is that businesses don't necessarily have to employ people. They don't have to hire people. So in other words, that money loaned to them by the government, and by the way, $13.5 billion in 1920s terms is loaned to businesses during this time period, but there's no guarantee that businesses will actually use that money, and there's no guarantee that that money will trickle down in some way, shape, or form to consumers. John Maynard Keynes would argue that if you give that money to consumers, well, they're going to have to spend money because, I mean, you got to eat, right? You got to get groceries. That consumers don't have as much freedom not to spend money as businesses. So Keynes would argue philosophically that really the engine of growth, the engine of growth in a modern economy isn't the big businesses. They're consumers. Businesses just emerge as a way to meet the demands and interests of consumers. So this is actually going to lead to, you know, this debate that we've been having for like almost at this point the last century between a group called the Keynesians and the monetarists. Even though we bring this debate back up when we get to the 1980s and Ronald Reagan, because it's the same basic debate. What is the primary engine of economic growth? If you believe that it's the consumer, then you're more likely to be a Keynesian. And so therefore, what you need to do in a crisis is to give the consumer additional money, additional support, and in return, that's going to lead to reduced unemployment because that'll stimulate the growth of businesses. If you are a monetarist, you believe that the engine of growth is business. And so everything you do should be to support businesses. $13.5 billion in federal loans is nothing to sneeze at. At the same time, though, $13.5 billion is nothing compared to the losses incurred in the Great Depression. It's basically giving an amputee a Band-Aid. And the fact that that money is directed to corporations rather than individuals primarily doesn't exactly go over very well. In fact, Herbert Hoover finds that he's almost universally loathed shortly after the Great Depression begins. You see the emergence of shanty towns. Basically, these small sort of developments that have been cobbled together by people who have lost their houses. They use things like plywood, basically tin roofing, that kind of thing, and they're called Hoovervilles. People who were covering themselves up with newspapers as a way to keep warm called them Hoover blankets. So you get the impression that Herbert Hoover is not only not going to win any popularity contest, but is also not going to win re-election in 1932. Speaking of 1932, to make matters even worse, 25,000 unemployed World War I vets march on Washington, D.C. In order to demand their bonuses. During the 1920s, Congress had passed a bill that would give all American veterans of World War I a lump sum of money by the year 1945. Well, many of these World War I vets made the argument that they didn't know if they're going to survive until 1945 because, to be honest, they're out of work. In many cases, they're homeless. And so wouldn't it be nice if they just got that sum now? Maybe reduce that sum, but a little bit of money now is going to be better than theoretical money later. Now, Hoover, for his part, was sympathetic to the bonus army marchers, but at the same time, he wasn't willing to give in to their demands. Well, the bonus army marchers actually set up Hoovervilles in the Washington Mall. Apparently, after a few prolonged skirmishes and scuffles with Washington police, Hoover orders the army to clear out the bonus army marchers. The thing is that clear out is a fairly nebulous and open-ended term or order. Well, General Douglas MacArthur, yes, this Douglas MacArthur, interprets that as sending in tanks and gas to basically disperse the bonus army marchers. So just think about how this looks. You are sending in troops and tanks and gas against people who have already fought and in many cases been injured and bled in their country's service. So the thing is that MacArthur doesn't get the blame for this, for basically misinterpreting his boss's orders. Not the last time MacArthur would do this. I'm looking at you, Korean War. But MacArthur doesn't get the blame. Hoover does. So again, at this point, it's a foregone conclusion that Hoover's out. And in fact, for millions of Americans, it looks like capitalism itself might collapse entirely. During the Great Depression, one of the things we kind of see is mass migration. More people immigrate away from the United States than immigrate to it. And many of those Americans are actually going to the Soviet Union, a communist state, because it looks like the Soviet Union so far has been insulated from the worst of the Depression. By the way, they're going to get a rude awakening during the 1940s, but it looks as if capitalism itself kind of loses some of its legitimacy. And it's not just the fact that Americans are leaving the country, they're also going other places entirely. Millions of Americans actually immigrate out west. Like, we think of, the settling of the frontier as something that happens during the 19th century, but the argument could be made that really the West is still pathetically small in terms of population compared to the East Coast until about the 1930s, because the West, specifically places like California, Nevada, Washington, Oregon, that region was the only region that still experienced some degree of economic growth. And if you've heard of, the novel The Grapes of Wrath, which, centers around two sort of wandering farm workers, that journey out west was something that was very, very common. By the way, this is a time period where millions of Mexican Americans are repatriated forcibly back to Mexico. Many of them are rounded up and just sent back across the border. And this is, in some respects, because of, yes, there is some, that it's partially based upon racism, but it's also based upon the fact that the employment situation is so dire. Even in places out in the West, Mexican Americans were utilized, especially as kind of like sharecroppers, as basically tenant farmers who would help harvest crops grown out in the West, and they're basically forced to return to Mexico. So one of the things that Hoover did is he actually sent some of his aides to ride the trains, and apparently during this time period, it was fairly common to see freight hoppers, people who would just kind of jump on board some of these freight cars and ride until they got to an appropriate destination. And Hoover's aides reported that they would see former millionaires, college professors, and deadbeats all in the same train car, and all united by the fact that none of them have jobs. They also reported that there's this revolutionary atmosphere, that people had had enough, and they wanted change. They didn't know exactly what kind of change they wanted, but by golly, they wanted change. This is the change they get. Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The fact that Roosevelt beats Hoover in 1932 is historically unimportant. Anything or anybody running against Hoover would have accomplished that same feat. Now, what's interesting about Roosevelt is this, if nothing else. He's the only president in U.S. history to serve more than 2 terms. In fact, he's elected to 4 terms. He served from 1933 until 1945, where he basically dies a few months into his 4th term. Now, of course, serving more than 2 terms is perfectly legal, but remember, Washington's going to give you the stink eye from on high if you do that, because there's this idea that a president should observe the precedent set by George Washington and basically leave after 2 terms. So, what makes Roosevelt so special? Why does he think that 2 terms, which were A-OK for George Washington, were not good enough for him? Well, Roosevelt has the very compelling argument that he needs more than 2 terms to solve the 2 great existential crises of the 20th century, which both fall within Roosevelt's term in office, or terms in office: the Great Depression and World War II, poverty and Hitler. So ultimately, that's what gives Roosevelt a very unique position in U.S. history. So 12 years is very different than 8 years. You had kids who grew up during FDR's term in office without knowing any other president. And Americans formed a relationship with Roosevelt like no other president before him. And we'll talk a little bit more about that specifically. But isn't it ironic that the president that's charged with navigating the country through the Great Depression had pretty much never worked a real job in his life? In fact, FDR was basically an aristocrat. He's from the Roosevelt family. Yes, that Roosevelt family. And apparently he was the second cousin of Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt, though, was also his uncle-in-law. I think I've told some of you guys this story, but Franklin Delano Roosevelt marries Eleanor Roosevelt, who was Teddy Roosevelt's favorite niece. And apparently at the wedding, Teddy Roosevelt comes and slaps FDR on the back and says, "Franklin, my boy, nothing like keeping a good name in the family," because after Eleanor Roosevelt is married, Eleanor Roosevelt becomes Eleanor Roosevelt Roosevelt. It might sound like a story from West Virginia, but no, it's a story of blue blood political dynasties in New York. But that being said, Roosevelt was almost regal and aristocratic in his bearing. We'll listen to a clip of FDR speaking, but you'll notice that he has this very affected accent. And probably the closest thing that you could describe it as is like some combination of American, sort of mid-Atlantic American English, and almost like a British accent. He was a posh guy. And he's the guy who's supposed to level with the millions of Americans who have lost their jobs. Now, this is a guy who was still dependent on his mother's allowance, even as President of the United States. And he's supposed to fix the Depression. Now, Roosevelt was not an economist. He was certainly less experienced and less knowledgeable than Herbert Hoover. This is, by the way, something that he himself admitted. And when Roosevelt is elected, or rather on the campaign trail, Roosevelt announces that he will basically gather together a team of the country's best economists and thinkers, and they would set up a plan for the first 100 days in office. And in that plan, theoretically, Roosevelt would produce a plan to kind of fix the Depression. But privately, Roosevelt had no idea what to do. In fact, he actually thought that Herbert Hoover's Reconstruction Finance Corporation was a pretty good start. Neither Hoover or FDR are all that ideological when it comes to figuring out solutions for the Great Depression. What Roosevelt does know something about, though, is empathy. As many of you know, Roosevelt suffered from polio, and it left him unable to walk. In fact, this picture right here is something that, well, let's just say that image is pretty rare, because anytime people took pictures of Roosevelt while he was in a wheelchair, the Secret Service would basically break the camera and confiscate the film. It wasn't like it was a state secret. If people really wanted to discover that Roosevelt needed a wheelchair, they could just do some research and find that out pretty easily. Members of the press knew that Roosevelt was a sufferer of polio. But again, there's just this very different environment during the 1930s and 1940s. They don't advertise that fact like they probably would today. So anyway, what happens is that Roosevelt actually gets polio later in life when he's an adult. And in fact, it almost kills him. Polio is something that is pretty rare in adults. In fact, it's almost, it's so unlikely that some historians have argued that Roosevelt might have suffered from something other than polio because it's just that rare to get in adulthood. But supposedly, what that experience taught him is that bad things can happen to otherwise good people, and through no fault of their own. Before polio, Roosevelt was kind of insufferably arrogant, and to be honest, probably wouldn't have made a very good president. But after polio, people noted that he was a very good and patient listener, somebody who seemed to be interested in people's problems. And there's no magic wand that you can wave in the Great Depression. The thing is that when we talk about the first and the second New Deal, you're going to discover that, ultimately that can help matters, but there's no government program that can fix a problem on the scale of the Great Depression. Now, remember that Herbert Hoover had really tried to do his best to fix the problem. In fact, his election slogan was in 1932 was a chicken in every pot. Hoover believed that really Americans just needed to kind of shake it off, to hunker down for a few months, and then everything would be okay. The problem is that you had this banking panic, and this banking panic was going out of control. And so Hoover was trying to do what he could to find a solution to the Depression, but he couldn't make a connection with the American people. Roosevelt could. When Roosevelt is elected President of the United States, in his inaugural address, he delivers probably the most famous quote that he's known for.
I believe that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
So you're out of a job. There's no food in the fridge. You don't have a fridge because it's the 1930s. But that being said, you still have no food. And it looks like every day just keeps getting worse. And then there's some guy who's never worked a day in his life who tells you that the only thing you have to fear is fear itself. Like, if I had to rank a list of catastrophically stupid things that people have said, this would be top 10 at the very least. Of course, people had tons of things to fear other than fear itself. Starvation, loss of job, just tons of things. Oh, and don't even get me started on Hitler and Stalin. There are tons of things to be afraid of. But at the same time, that's exactly what people wanted to hear. Sometimes what parents have to do, or any authority figure has to do, is to tell you it's going to be okay, even though that authority figure, that parent, isn't really sure if it's going to be okay or not. That's just what you do as a leader sometimes. Why, I suppose. But Roosevelt, when he says that the only thing that people have to fear is fear itself, it seems to work. And Roosevelt kind of builds on this relationship that he establishes with the American people. And yes, he does establish a relationship with the American people. He might be the first president to really do that, thanks to technology. The thing is that radio kind of comes into its own during the 1920s, and during Roosevelt's presidency, he regularly broadcast directly to the American people through what's called the fireside chats. This is where Roosevelt would basically tell you exactly what the problem is and exactly what the government is going to do about it. Now, the thing is that um, radio is a very unique and special medium. It's not like written text where you can basically construct somebody's voice in your head. And that may or may not actually be like the person who actually wrote the speech in the first place. It's also not like television where you can see the person speaking, warts and all. Radio has the effect of providing you with this disembodied voice that almost sounds like they are talking to you specifically. And one of the things that I read is that during the Great Depression, what people would sometimes do to save money is they would power things down early, turn off the heat, and then just go to bed early to save power, and then get up the next day and go to work, if indeed they had work. And while everybody is there, it's cold, it's the dead of night because you've, again, powered on all the electricity, and you're bundled up under the covers, and then late at night, the radio would turn on, and you would hear Franklin Delano Roosevelt's voice telling you it was all going to be okay. When people talk about the fireside chats and how they perceived Roosevelt, he was regularly described as almost a father figure or a grandfather figure. And then I read one account that said, when I heard the voice of Roosevelt, I didn't hear my father. When I heard Roosevelt, I heard the voice of God. Now, I'm not sure how common that sentiment was, but it does show you just how powerful Roosevelt's connection was with the American people. And he could get people to do things that no president before or since could do. And this is probably best explained with the New Deal. So the New Deal kind of comes as part of this 100-day campaign or pledge or effort to kind of correct the economy after the Depression. So the first New Deal is structured specifically to fix the problem in banking, and also to kind of deal with the problem of unemployment. Then there's a second New Deal that comes later that provides some worker and labor protections. Again, as I mentioned, the New Deal in itself, either the first or second New Deal, they don't fix the Depression. And that might say something more about the Depression than it does about the New Deal. But the New Deal basically involves the government basically directly intervening and in some respects taking over entire sectors of the economy. It actually involves the S word, socialism, where entire sectors of the economy become socialized. Now, again, the question is, does it work? Well, no. Objectively, the economy does not improve, or let's say recover, from either the first or the second New Deal. But as some of you probably already know, what ultimately fixes the economy is the huge amount of government spending that's invested into the wartime economy during the Second World War. So, in some respects, if you're looking at this as an example of government spending, I suppose the conclusion that you can jump to is that government spending does and can fix a depression. You just need a good war for it, I guess, which is a sort of a bleak and nihilistic point to kind of make. For some historians and some teachers, the New Deal is about these government organizations with based around acronyms and the role they play. And to be honest, I think that probably the most significant impact of the New Deal is not all this. It's not all this. Rather, it's what happens shortly after FDR is elected. So before we get to the government programs, you should know that basically from 1929 until 1932, the banking sector had continued to hemorrhage and lose money. Roosevelt's election really didn't do anything to correct problems or correct matters. So what happens is that Roosevelt understands that if things continue, there might not be a banking sector left. And people have strong feelings about banks, but you still need them. Because the thing is that if you want to open a business, if you want to build a house, if you want to do anything that leads to economic growth, in other words, leads to economic recovery, you need a bank. It's in a lot of respects like the engine of your economy. And if you don't have banks, you don't have growth. And if you don't have growth, you don't get out of a depression. So you got to fix the banks. The problem is that there's this panic feedback loop. People go to the banks because they're not sure if there's any money left in the banks. And then when people go to the banks and withdraw money, basically that becomes almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. They drain all the funds from banks, and then the banks go bankrupt, and that leads to people getting even more panicked. So in some respects, what Roosevelt brings to the table is not economic know-how, but his ability to connect with the American people. So very shortly after he's elected, he announces that there's going to be a banking holiday in which Americans are not going to be able to withdraw money from the banks, to give the banks some breathing room. And what he basically does is he appears on one of his fireside chats and pleads with Americans to keep their deposits, to keep their savings within the banks. And he does that in his, sort of trademark empathetic way. And then what happens is that after the banking holiday ends, Americans don't actually withdraw money from the banks, or rather, deposits, in other words, Americans putting money into banks, exceed the number of Americans taking money out of banks. So, there are very few speeches, very few instances in history where words change history, where good speeches change history. But Roosevelt's fireside chats, where he basically makes Americans feel confident in a banking system that they really shouldn't have felt confident in at all, probably saves the national economy. Because if Americans had continued to withdraw their savings at that rate, there might not have been a banking sector left to save. That being said, though, Roosevelt understands that it's not just good words that will solve the problem. There need to be reforms. The problem is that banks had basically lent out too much of their money. And anytime there had been a bank run in U.S. history, banks were always very, very vulnerable because they tended to lend money out very aggressively and very carelessly. So, what Roosevelt announces as part of his kind of 100 days in office plan is he announces the Glass-Steagall Act and the Emergency Banking Act. Basically, what this does is that it allows the federal government to inspect banks. But at the same time, even though banks are going to be regulated, just like the meatpacking industry is going to be regulated, um, there's a carrot here too, and that is that the federal government will take steps to bail out banks and ensure that at the very least, individual account holders will be protected from another bank panic. This is what happens with the Glass-Steagall Act, which establishes something called the FDIC, which stands for the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. This is where the federal government basically insures $2,500 of every American's savings account. They don't insure anything above $2,500, but that was still probably about a reasonable annual salary for most Americans. So you have some degree of security, but in return, the federal government is now going to inspect banks, and they also want banks to keep more cash on hand. The federal government is also taking steps to regulate the stock market a little bit more. The federal government creates what is called the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, which even today is the agency that's responsible for regulating the stock market. And to, I suppose, raise morale, the federal government also repeals the 21st Amendment, the Prohibition Amendment. Now, the other thing that happens, though, is that the federal government steps in and actually starts taking over entire sectors of the economy. So if you're looking at examples of Keynesian reforms, you're going to see these with the alphabet soup programs created by the New Deal. So back in the 1920s, for instance, the problem with farming is that American farmers were too efficient. They were producing too many crops or harvesting too many crops, and that was lowering the price. So the question is how do you get prices to climb back up? Well, you create the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. Now, think about this. The AAA would basically pay farmers to either not grow as much, or in some cases, they would pay farmers to destroy crops, which sounds incredibly wasteful. But the idea is that if you reduce the supply, you increase the demand. And because farmers are kind of like a cantankerous bunch with an independent streak, what you need to do to get that to happen is to pay them. You also have the National Industrial Recovery Act, which establishes an early form of the minimum wage. It also establishes what is called the National Recovery Administration, or the NRA, not to be confused with the National Rifle Administration. And this organization would regulate and sometimes dictate basically government demands to businesses. So in other words, one of the things we're kind of seeing is the federal government taking on a role in the economy that it's never really had before. One of the things that I've read is that the legacy of the Great Depression is the fact that the federal government, in some respects, becomes important, actually important, and that maybe all this talk about federalism and the increase in power of the federal government, it's all really led up to this point, because before the Great Depression, you would have to go a long way to find evidence that the federal government actually existed, at least in small towns throughout the country. I mean, you have the post office, but that's really it. That's the only indication that the federal government really exists, unless you want to take a field trip to Washington. After the Great Depression, every bank in the country has these initials, FDIC. By the way, if your bank doesn't have those initials, I suggest that you try to invest your money elsewhere. But anyway, the federal government is now not just important in the aggregate, it's important to individual Americans. And in some cases, it employs individual Americans. So, for example, if you have the Civilian Conservation Corps, basically the federal government is paying millions of basically young people, high school, college age, to basically work on public works, parks, build irrigation ditches, things that don't necessarily have a lot of intrinsic value. But remember, the whole idea of Keynesian economics is that it doesn't really matter what people are doing or whether it's productive. What matters is that people are going to work. Yes, it's not incredibly efficient, but if people are out of work for a very, very long time, then one of the things that happens is that it's harder, once you've been out of work for a while, to go back into it. So give people something to do, because, and this is something that it's kind of hard to explain, I think, but the idea of doing absolutely nothing sounds pretty cool for like 2 weeks, and then it starts to get old. People actually want something to do, and for better or for worse, for most people, at least in the United States, that sense of purpose is found in a job. And so if you take that away, it also leads to feelings of worthlessness. And that's also harm that can't be quantified. So give them something to do. And by the way, here's an example of some of these Civilian Conservation Corps jobs. Anyway, you also have the CWA, the Civilian Works Administration, where the federal government is paying people to basically create art. A lot of the statues, a lot of the publicly funded art that you see in small towns throughout the country is actually funded by the CWA. And I also have to plug the CWA here, because the CWA also paid hundreds of historians to go throughout the country and get firsthand accounts of life during the Civil War. And we have some audio recordings of what life was like for slaves that were basically paid for and funded by the CWA. Also, one of the things that kind of happens, speaking of federalism, is that the federal government becomes even more powerful than state governments, because the federal government is lending money to states so they can stave off bankruptcy. What this means is that Roosevelt enacts a very radical plan to fix the Great Depression. We don't really see him as a socialist, but if we're talking about basically taking over entire sectors of the economy, that's what it kind of looks like. And for many Americans, particularly middle and upper class Americans, that's exactly how they saw it. Because one of the things that happens is that you have extraordinary tax increases during Roosevelt's administration so that some of these programs could be paid for. Next time, we'll talk about some of the resistance to the New Deal and how the New Deal itself creates strong supporters but also strong opponents.